basically, if you look at the history of thought from the mercantilists, the physiocrats, the classicals, they had different theories, but they did bring it back down to this issue of how to steer the economy in such a way that we make it more productive and perhaps nurture and reward those activities that we think are actually creating stuff. Adam Smith especially brought it down to material stuff. He had a material versus non-material notion. Marx was much more subtle than that, but they all had different takes on it. So the mercantilists, at a time in which there was a lot of trade and there was the emphasis on terms of trade, put the focus on exchange. And so they wanted to make sure that the exchange rates were right, the terms of exchange were right. This kind of, think of Trump today. Basically, he's gone back about 400 years. The physiocrats, in a period in which most wealth was still created on agricultural lands, not surprisingly put value, so productive capital, in what farmers were doing in land. And they had a very interesting, I'll show you in a minute, the tableau économique, which actually divided society into three different classes, but really the productive ones were the farmers. And classical economic theory, so Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx. I hate to tell you, Matthew, actually, my stopwatch isn't working. Oh, yes, it is good. Just to make sure I don't go over. The classical economists who were writing during the Industrial Revolution, not surprisingly, put labor and industrial labor at the heart of where they thought that sort of production boundary lied. And what I want to argue, and I'll come to this at the end, but let me just give you the punchline now so that you sort of follow what I'm saying, is that then something happened. Okay? We moved from an objective theory, where there were sort of concrete things that we could say perhaps were at the center of the value creation process, to a more subjective understanding. So preferences and kind of value in the eye of the beholder. And I want to concentrate on what the implications of that are today for some of the biggest ills that I think are affecting our economy. And it's not going to be surprising that I'll start with what's happening around finance and financialization of the economy. But just believe me that today in neoclassical economics, which is taught all over the world, in economics departments, first of all, what's interesting is they don't even talk about value. There's one theory of value being taught, and we've sort of rid economics departments of this history of different theories of value, but also by then not questioning it, it doesn't even have to be called value theory. In fact, the word itself has disappeared. It's basically Econ 101. Okay? And so that's actually the key point in the book. What happens when value is no longer contested? Different takes on value. What happens also to policymakers' ability to steer the economy in particular ways that create more or less value? So as I said, what was quite interesting in the physiocrats who were writing in the 1700s, different ones, Quenet, Turgot are the most famous. They actually didn't always agree on everything. They had three different classes, and it was the productive class were definitely the farmers, and this was probably the first ever Excel spreadsheet. In fact, and really what the question was, when value was produced by the farmers, how it's then actually distributed and the degree to which it gets reinvested back into the land versus siphoned off by the proprietors, who were basically the landlords. And then the sterile class, that wasn't actually the worst class, it was the proprietors who were siphoning it out of the system. The sterile class, who were basically the merchants, were of course important for getting the goods, the farming goods, to the shops. But if that part of society, the merchant class, was too large, that would actually then hurt the actual kind of key engine of growth, which was in the farm. And Adam Smith is actually quite interesting. We were just talking, Matthew and I, about the theater, because we just saw each other there. And I really think that Adam Smith must have just gone to the opera when he wrote this, when he was looking at productive and unproductive labor, because he really had it in it for opera singers and opera dancers. It's not just, he had this whole list of the unproductive members of society, and opera singers and opera dancers are not productive. Anyway, you obviously are not going to read this whole thing, but just to say, he had, it was quite interesting because he had what was basically a classical labor theory of value, but he made a very clear distinction between it, literally in terms of what people were doing, the category of work, whereas Marx, who came after him, was much more subtle. He said that, yes, labor is where value comes from, but it doesn't mean then that if you are in the financial sector, you're unproductive. He tied the concept of production and productive labor to whether surplus value was being created. And surplus value, as you know, was tied to his understanding of labor exploitation. So as long as the activity, he didn't look at sectors or categories of work, the activity of a particular financier or merchant was in fact allowing that surplus value to be realized, then he called them productive. But it wasn't a normative point. This wasn't productive is good, unproductive is bad. He was looking at what actually produces profits and the degree to which those profits are reinvested, allowing the capitalist accumulation process to happen. And the key insights from the classicals was, first of all, that there was a very strong objective component, right, of value. It was tied to cost of production, to labor, to the division of labor. The RSA has just done a great review of labor and work and the effect that new forms of work have a potential future of both wages and amount of work, so employment. And he was actually looking at those issues too, right? So his whole pin factory example, which has gone down in history as being very important in thinking about the division of labor, was very much tied also to the changing conditions, the changes in technological change and how that affects the organization of production. But the reason he cared was because labor was at the center of the value creation process. And of course, Marx as well. The reason I, by the way, became an economist who focuses a lot on innovation is because I actually read Capital, volume 1, 2, and 3, in 3 languages, believe it or not, because I actually became an economist in Mexico City. That's a whole other story. As a history major, I did my junior year abroad in Mexico and then left this program to actually go study economics in the economics department in the UNAM, and they were reading Marx. And I was fascinated when I was reading Marx with capitalism. So the real interesting thing in Marx is, even though he was a critic of capitalism, as we all know, he actually appreciated the role of technological change and was looking, again, at the big questions that we asked today about the effect of robots on employment. He was already looking at that then. David Ricardo, famous chapter he wrote in 1821 in his Principles textbook. He was a chapter called On Machinery. He was already back then looking at the effect that machinery, which was again happening because of the Industrial Revolution, was having on both employment and wages. So all these guys really focused on innovation, production, division of labor, change in this objective way, as well as this issue around reproduction of the system. You know, if too much is being siphoned out, so in the case of the physiocrats already looking at the siphoning out from the role of landlords, then the system would potentially fall apart.